In this week's module, we're going to focus on assessment and grading. And one of the most common assessments used in college are exams. So we're going to start with chapter 24, which is about helping students prepare for exams. The specific objectives for this lecture are to discuss the purpose of exams and our role in helping students prepare. By the end of this video, you will also be able to suggest strategies teachers can use to encourage self-regulated learning and reduce test anxiety. So let's reflect on your own experience as a learner. What is the purpose of exams or tests or quizzes? Why do we have them? Well, from an educational perspective, they're designed to help us identify the extent to which students have learned what we are trying to teach them. So that might be critical concepts or vocabulary, that fundamental knowledge they need to have. It could be a procedure or how to go about completing something, or maybe analyzing a situation and determining the next step to take. It could be how to create a new product, or outlining details or steps, procedures to follow, as I've noted. So there's a number of reasons we have to have exams. They do serve a purpose, but we as educators are hopefully making that clear to our students. So it's important that we help students prepare for these exams. We know by the time they get to college, they have taken a number of exams, standardized exams, district assessments, whatever they're called. And we need to remind them that different types of exams require different types of study strategies. So if they are being asked to memorize or recall information, such as definitions of terms, they're going to have to prepare for that a little differently than if they're going to be presented with a case or a situation and have to analyze that and write out their response, their procedure, their justification. Students often need help with their study strategy, and there's things that we can do to help them that keeps the focus on the learning process. So the key things that arise in terms of testing that are issues in our college classrooms, there's several, but we can narrow those down to two key things. The first is the stress that students feel when they're approached with having to take an exam or a test. And test anxiety can impact a number of areas, and some students have different levels of test anxiety, and these are different symptoms that you can see here about what that could look like for them. The other is that sometimes students have low self-efficacy, or this perceived lack of skill in taking exams. And that might be they struggle with understanding what will be on it, or how to respond, or what level of depth answers should be, or just how to approach it. So as educators, we can do things to help address these two issues that some students will experience with test taking. So you've taken a number of exams, quizzes, or tests in your college career, or perhaps you've worked with students on this topic. So reflect on the advice that you would give others. And maybe it's advice that you yourself have followed to be successful. So there's a few things that we can do to alleviate some of those issues for our students. One is we can help students develop study habits by expressly saying, this week you should spend 3 hours reading this chapter and reviewing it. Students need to be reminded to develop a routine. They typically have a more free time in their schedule, meaning they're not scheduled from 8 to 5 in a classroom, or 8 to 4 like they might have been in high school. So they may need help developing a routine, and this is especially important, I have found, with first year students. They need to recognize that learning takes work across time and that they can't cram it into one session. When I taught Raider Ready, which is for first year students, I would tell them no one's giving you a badge of honor for pulling an all-nighter. So they need to recognize that they need to space out their study sessions. And we know that they need time for new information to go through working memory and go to long-term memory. And one of the best ways they can improve that is through this practice retrieval. So they need to be quizzing themselves and others. They need to be able to explain it at the end of a study session. Tell them that the test or the quiz is a check-in on their learning and how well they're doing. Have them reflect on past successes that they've done well. You could, if you wanted, embrace behavioral relaxation techniques. So this means help students who are really struggling. This is probably more likely in a one-on-one consultation. Practice deep breathing. You could refer them to additional resources on campus that specifically help students work on meditation or reflection, how to calm themselves when they're approaching a test. And then, although we can, always encourage it, we don't know how often our students are following this advice, but we hope that they're resting, getting enough sleep, and eating a healthy diet. So in the book, the authors outlined that we've already talked about several reading and review strategies, and I've summarized those here for you. And depending on what you teach and what you need students to be able to do, you might pull out some of these ideas and integrate them in your courses. You could also encourage them to draw visual representations of the material, and that visual might help them recall information when it gets to the exam. There's also active study strategies that you can implement. If you are teaching a course that has several quizzes or exams, then building in opportunities for students to come to review sessions is really helpful. You can also provide review guides, helping them focus in specifically on what will be on this next test. Allows them to focus their learning, and they already feel more equipped to do well. At many campuses, they might have supplemental instruction or help sessions, or I've never heard of course clinics, but I like the idea of that. But for large enrollment classes that students are in, such as biology, chemistry, physics, I've seen them for math classes. There might be additional resources on campus that they can pursue to help with this area. And then going over previous exams for the class, if you have the luxury of a big test bank and you could go over some example questions with them, that always helps students feel more equipped for the next exam. So these strategies are good for helping students check their learning, but they also do help address anxiety. And we hear this concern a lot from our students. I don't know if they're more or less anxious than they used to be, but they're certainly more comfortable talking about it. And so acknowledging that and building in some structure to how you address that can help, especially if you have several tests and students get anxious about them. So providing those active review strategies, such as the test review, helps pull down anxiety because they know what to expect. You don't want to tell them the test will be hard or difficult. My daughter's dance teacher, she says the only word we use is excited. We never talk about, are you nervous or scared? We don't say that. We say, are you excited? Now, I don't know if students would be excited about a test, but I like the philosophy of that. Don't put these words in their mind. Just avoid that. During the test, it says try not to walk around and look over shoulders. I do think that you need to be looking around the room if you're testing in person, but don't interrupt because that interrupts their flow of thought. Let them know when the test will be and stick to that. Be clear about your grading. You could consider dropping the lowest test or quiz score. Everyone has a bad day. Test frequently so that they are constantly practicing that. Tailor tests to time allotted, and I think that takes time for you as an instructor to determine what's appropriate for students to get done in the allotted time. And then we've already mentioned, if you feel comfortable doing this, you could teach them some relaxation techniques or at least refer them to resources so that they could identify what works for them. So with that in mind, for the first topic in this week's discussion post, I want you to identify one anxiety reduction strategy you could use as a teacher. And this could be from the book or other online resources. Maybe it's a campus resource you knew of from where you went to school. So describe the strategy and then how you would implement it, such as, are there any resources you would need? I'm not saying that you would, but let us know what it would take for you to implement that anxiety reduction strategy that you could use to help your students as they approach a test. So in review, testing is necessary to ensure students are reviewing, synthesizing, and retaining material. And they are necessary to gain a better understanding of what students are actually learning. As instructors, we can implement strategies to encourage students to study effectively and reduce test anxiety. There's many ways to do this, but providing study guides and practice questions is one approach that will help them focus on those key learning outcomes. But overall, being clear with your expectations and explaining what the exam will look like helps reduce test anxiety and will improve performance.